If you're enjoying these stories, you can support us on Patreon. There are several unique stories over there that I haven't uploaded to YouTube. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you can. Now, let's get into the story. It was in the latter days of November, in the year 1888, that a fierce gale swept across London, bringing with it a driving rain that rattled the window panes of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The weather was as bleak and unforgiving as the mood of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For 3 days he had paced the carpet, alternating between bouts of furious, discordant scraping upon his violin and long periods of silent contemplation in his deep armchair, enveloped in thick clouds of acrid smoke from his cherrywood pipe. Criminal enterprise, he had complained bitterly only that morning, had lost all its daring and romance. The London underworld had devolved into a state of dreary, unimaginative commonplace. I was seated by the fire, engrossed in a rather dry medical treatise on tropical diseases, when the sharp clatter of a hansom cab pulling up to our curb broke the monotonous drumming of the rain. I glanced out the window, wiping away the condensation from the glass. "A visitor, Holmes?" I remarked, watching a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy ulster step down onto the wet pavement. He paused to pay the driver, his collar turned up against the wind. And, by the look of his sturdy boots and the purposeful stride, I should say he is a man accustomed to authority. He moves with a certain martial stiffness, though his garments are decidedly civilian. The manner in which he barked at the cabman suggests a man used to giving orders and having them promptly obeyed. I note, too, the way he scrutinizes the numbers on the doors, with the sharp, appraising eye of a man hunting down a specific quarry rather than a casual caller. Holmes did not look up from the chemical apparatus, where he was currently engaged in boiling a malodorous purple fluid that bubbled ominously in a glass retort. The pungent scent of it was beginning to overpower the smell of his strong shag tobacco. "Let us hope, Watson, that he brings something more stimulating than the recovery of a purloined lapdog or the tracing of a wayward clerk. The minor inconveniences of the middle classes have grown intolerably tedious to me of late. Though, judging by the heavy measured tread upon the stairs, a tread that speaks of solid provincial leather rather than the light step of a Londoner, I would venture that we are about to receive an emissary from the provincial constabulary. Scottish, if I am not mistaken." "My dear Holmes, how could you possibly know that?" I asked, turning to him in surprise, my book entirely forgotten. "The mud on his boots, Watson, is of a peculiar reddish-brown hue, characteristic of the clay found in the border regions. You will recall my monograph on the tracing of origins through the soil adhered to footwear. That particular tint is quite distinct from the grey sludge of London streets or the chalky loam of Kent. Furthermore, the telegram I received an hour ago from Edinburgh warned me to expect Inspector Farquhar of the Berwickshire Police. It is a matter of simple deduction, synthesized with advance notice." Before I could reply to this characteristic display, Mrs. Hudson opened the door, her face a mask of long-suffering patience regarding Holmes's chemical experiments. She announced our visitor with a degree of relief, likely hoping he would interrupt the brewing stench. Inspector Farquhar was a formidable figure, dominating the doorway. He possessed a weather-beaten face, scored with deep lines that spoke of a life spent out of doors in harsh climates. Sharp grey eyes assessed the room instantly, and a thick, bristling moustache obscured his upper lip. He removed his sodden deerstalker, slapping it against his thigh to dislodge the rein, and nodded stiffly to us both, carrying the scent of damp wool and cold air into the warm room. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice carrying the deep, rolling burr of his native Scotland, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "The same," Holmes replied, gesturing to a vacant armchair near the hearth with the stem of his pipe. "And this is my friend and colleague, Dr. John Watson, whose medical knowledge has often proven invaluable in these matters. Pray, take a seat by the fire, Inspector. You have had a long and uncomfortable journey from Lauder. The winds on the East Coast route must have been devilish last night. I perceive you took the overnight express and have come directly from King's Cross without pausing to change." The inspector stared at Holmes in astonishment, freezing halfway to the chair. "It is as they say, Mr. Holmes. You have the sight. I did indeed come from Lauder, and I have not stopped for rest or refreshment since I boarded the train. The urgency of my business allowed no delay. Your exhaustion is evident in your posture. The slight sag of your broad shoulders and the soot of the railway carriage still clings to your cuffs and the hem of your ulster," Holmes said smoothly, finally extinguishing the Bunsen burner with a sharp twist of his wrist and taking the chair opposite our guest. He steepled his long, thin fingers together. "Now, Inspector, what tragedy has occurred in the Scottish borders that requires a senior officer to abandon his post and seek the aid of a private consultant in London? The local constabulary is rarely so swift to admit defeat unless the circumstances are exceptionally bizarre." Farquhar sighed deeply, a sound like wind rushing through a narrow gorge. He settled into the chair, rubbing his large, calloused hands together toward the flames, trying to chase the deep chill from his bones. "It is a black business, Mr. Holmes, a matter so baffling, so entirely beyond the realm of reason, that I fear I am out of my depth. I have seen violence in my time, sir, barroom brawls and crimes of passion, but this defies all logic. I have come to consult you on the sudden and inexplicable death of Mrs. Euphemia Stewart of Lauder House." Holmes's eyes, previously dull and listless, suddenly gleamed with a predatory interest. He leaned forward, the lethargy of the past 3 days vanishing in an instant. "The wealthy widow of the iron magnate? I seem to recall a brief mention in the Times yesterday, buried in the late editions. An unexpected heart failure, if I remember correctly. The article mentioned her advanced age and delicate constitution." "That was the story given to the press, sir, hastily concocted by the family physician to prevent a panic amongst the servants and the village," Farquhar said grimly, his jaw setting hard. "But it was no failing of the heart that took Mrs. Stewart. That was a lie to buy us time. It was murder, Mr. Holmes. Cold, calculated, and executed in a manner that appears entirely impossible." "Impossible?" I echoed, drawn irresistibly into the narrative. "That is a strong word, Inspector." "I use the word advisedly, Dr. Watson. The facts of the case are these, and I challenge anyone to make sense of them. Lauder House is a formidable old stone manor built upon the ruins of a medieval keep, situated on a lonely, desolate stretch of moorland some 2 miles from the village proper. It is a bleak, unwelcoming place. Mrs. Stewart was a woman of 74, fiercely independent, notoriously eccentric, and deeply paranoid. Flow edit. Changed the second fiercely to deeply to avoid repetition and improve the rhythm of the sentence. She kept her wealth, substantial sums in gold bullion and uncut jewels, a fortune built on pig iron and shrewd investments, locked within a heavy iron safe in her bedchamber. Consequently, she trusted no one, not even her own long-serving servants, and went to extraordinary lengths to secure her privacy and safety, treating her home as a fortress. Farquhar paused, drawing a small, well-worn leather notebook from his breast pocket and adjusting a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles upon his nose. On Tuesday evening she retired to her bedchamber at precisely 9 o'clock, as was her rigid, unchanging custom. Her personal maid, a young woman named Flora, attended her, preparing her for the night. Flora locked the heavy oak door from the outside, turning the key twice, but Mrs. Stewart, as always, then slid a massive internal iron bolt into place, effectively sealing herself in. The windows of the bedchamber are narrow, mullioned glass, leaded and firmly secured from within by heavy brass latches that were checked by Flora before she left. Furthermore, they are located on the second floor, a sheer, terrifying drop of 40 feet to the flagged courtyard below, with not a creeping ivy, drainpipe, or architectural flourish to afford purchase to even the most agile climber. "A locked room," Holmes murmured, his eyes half closed in intense concentration, a faint smile playing upon his thin lips. A classic, if somewhat overused, feature of the criminal repertoire. It is the sort of puzzle that delights the amateur and frustrates the professional. Pray continue, Inspector. Every detail is vital. The following morning, at 7 o'clock, Flora knocked upon the door to bring the mistress her morning tea. There was no answer. After knocking repeatedly and calling out loudly enough to rouse the corridor, she became alarmed and summoned the butler, an old retainer named Angus. Together they attempted to force the door, throwing their combined weight against it, but the oak was too stout and the iron bolt held fast. Finally, in desperation, they summoned the groundskeeper, who brought a heavy felling axe from the woodpile. They smashed through the sturdy panels, reached in, and managed to draw back the stubborn bolt. "And within?" I prompted, thoroughly gripped by the narrative, leaning forward in my chair. Within they found a room perfectly undisturbed, a scene of absolute domestic tranquillity. The fire in the hearth had burned down to cold ash. Consistency, check. Keep an eye on the cold ash detail here, as it conflicts slightly with the residual heat mentioned later during the bullet discovery. The safe holding her vast fortune was untouched, locked securely, and the key remained upon her bedside table. The windows remained securely fastened from the inside, the dust upon the sills undisturbed. But Mrs. Stewart was dead. "Where was the body?" Holmes asked sharply, his voice snapping like a whip. She was seated in her high-backed armchair, facing the fireplace, her Bible open upon her lap to the Book of Psalms. At first glance she appeared to have fallen asleep while reading. But upon closer inspection, the local physician, Dr. MacDonald, discovered a terrible truth. He found a small, perfectly circular puncture wound upon the crown of her head, just above the hairline. "A puncture wound?" I interjected, my medical training asserting itself. "Caused by what instrument? A wound to that area would require significant force." "That is the devil of it, Doctor. The wound penetrated the thickest part of the skull and pierced the brain, causing near instantaneous death. Yet there was no weapon found anywhere in the room. No stiletto, no hatpin, no projectile of any kind, despite a thorough search of the carpet and furniture. Moreover, there were no powder burns to indicate a firearm had been discharged at close range, and none of the servants who sleep in the wing adjacent heard any sound resembling a gunshot during the night. The door was bolted. The windows were sealed. It is as if a phantom descended upon her, struck her a mortal blow, and vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of its presence. Holmes sprang to his feet, his lethargy entirely vanquished, his eyes burning with the fierce, focused energy that I knew so well. The hunt was afoot. "Excellent!" he cried, rubbing his hands together in a gesture of pure anticipation. "A locked room, a silent weapon, an invisible assassin. Inspector, you have brought me a pearl of a problem, a true intellectual challenge. The commonplace has fled, and romance returns to the world. Watson, if you would be so kind as to look up the train schedules to Edinburgh in the Bradshaw. We must depart for the north without delay. The trail is still warm, and we have a phantom to catch." The journey to Scotland was a long and arduous one. We departed King's Cross on the Flying Scotsman, the great locomotive tearing through the English countryside, throwing off a billowing plume of white steam into the grey November sky. For the first few hours Holmes sat in complete silence, enveloped in a haze of strong shag tobacco, his eyes fixed blankly upon the rushing landscape. I knew better than to interrupt his train of thought when his mind was actively dissecting a problem. It was only as we crossed the border into Scotland, the gentle hills giving way to rugged heather-clad moors, that he finally stirred, knocking the ashes from his pipe. "Well, Watson," he said, turning to me with a spark of amusement in his eyes, "what do you make of Inspector Farquhar's impossible crime?" "It seems to defy all natural laws," I confessed. "If the door was bolted from the inside and the windows were securely latched, how could a murderer possibly enter or exit? Could there be a secret passage in the old manor? A common fallback in the lesser works of romantic fiction, but rarely encountered in practical criminology," Holmes replied dismissively. "Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that the room was precisely as described, a sealed box. If the murderer could not be inside the room, then the fatal blow must have been delivered from outside. But how? Through the window? Farquhar stated the windows were latched. Furthermore, Mrs. Stewart was seated facing the fireplace with her back to the room. The wound was upon the crown of her head. For a projectile to strike her there from the window, it would have to navigate corners in a manner contrary to the laws of physics. No, Watson, we must look to the only other opening in the room." "The fireplace," I exclaimed. "The chimney." "Precisely. A chimney flue is an aperture, albeit a narrow and vertical one. If she was seated close to the hearth, bending forward slightly to read her Bible by the fading light of the fire, the top of her head would be exposed to the chimney." "But Holmes, to shoot a woman down a chimney? It seems absurd. A man would have to be standing upon the roof, and even then the angle would be impossibly steep. Besides, the servants heard no gunshot." "Ah, the silence of the weapon. That is the most intriguing feature of all," Holmes murmured, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "A puncture wound, fatal, yet leaving no projectile behind, or at least none that the good Scottish doctor could readily identify. No noise, no smoke. I have a theory, Watson, but I must examine the scene of the tragedy before I commit myself. The architecture of Lauder House and the topography of its surrounding moorland will tell us the rest." We arrived at the village of Lauder in the late afternoon. The light was already failing, casting long, melancholic shadows across the rolling hills. Inspector Farquhar, who had telegraphed ahead, met us at the station with a sturdy dog-cart. The drive to Lauder House took us along a winding, rutted road that cut through the desolate, windswept moors. As we crested a rise, the manor came into view. It was a bleak, imposing structure of dark, unyielding stone, flanked by two crumbling medieval towers. It stood upon a slight elevation, commanding a view of the surrounding countryside. A dense copse of bare, skeletal trees stood some 300 yards to the east, while to the west the ground rose sharply into a steep, rocky ridge. A lonely place, I shivered, pulling my coat tighter against the biting wind. Lonely and highly defensible, Holmes observed, his sharp eyes sweeping the terrain. Notice the ridge to the west, Watson. It overlooks the house, though it is at a considerable distance. We were welcomed at the heavy oak doors by Angus, the butler, a frail man whose pale face and trembling hands betrayed the shock he had suffered. He led us into the grand hall, a cavernous room hung with faded tapestries and the stern portraits of bygone Stuarts. "I have kept the room exactly as it was, Mr. Holmes," Inspector Farquhar assured us as we ascended the grand staircase. "I posted a constable at the door to ensure nothing was disturbed." The bedchamber of the late Mrs. Stewart was a large, oppressive room. Heavy velvet drapes framed the windows, and the walls were panelled in dark, aged oak. The centrepiece of the room was a massive stone fireplace, above which hung a display of crossed claymores. An armchair was positioned squarely in front of the hearth. Holmes immediately set to work. He moved with the sudden, precise energy of a hunting dog that has caught a scent. He produced his magnifying glass and tape measure, dropping to his hands and knees. He examined the shattered panels of the door, confirming that the heavy iron bolt had indeed been thrown from within. He inspected the windows, satisfying himself that the thick dust on the sills was undisturbed and the latches were locked tight. He then turned his attention to the armchair. He examined the fabric, the floor beneath it, and finally the fireplace itself. He knelt before the cold hearth, burying his hands in the ashes, much to the inspector's bewilderment. He withdrew a small, misshapen lump of metal, brushing the soot away with his thumb. "What is that, Holmes?" I asked, stepping closer. "This, Watson, is the reason Dr. MacDonald found no weapon," Holmes said softly, his eyes shining with triumph. He held it out on the palm of his hand. It was a deformed piece of lead, flattened and splayed. "A bullet!" Farquhar gasped. "But not a standard one," Holmes replied. "Notice the composition. It is exceptionally soft lead, designed to expand upon impact. It struck the poor woman's skull, did its lethal work, and then dropped into the ashes of the hearth, where its shape was further distorted by the residual heat of the embers." "Then she was shot," the inspector cried. "But from where, and by whom? There is still the matter of the locked door, and the silence." Holmes did not answer immediately. He stepped into the cavernous fireplace, ignoring the soot that clung to his tweed suit. He tilted his head back, staring straight up the dark, narrow shaft of the chimney flue. For a long minute he remained perfectly still. "Inspector," Holmes said, his voice echoing slightly in the brick shaft, "has this chimney been modified recently?" "Why, yes," Farquhar replied, looking surprised. "Mrs. Stewart had the flues rebuilt last summer. She complained of the draughts. The architect installed a modern straight flue, quite narrow, to improve the draw of the smoke. "A straight flue," Holmes repeated with satisfaction, stepping back into the room. "No bends, no cowls, a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the sky. Look up, Watson, tell me what you see." I took his place in the hearth and peered upward into the darkness. Far above, at the very top of the long, narrow shaft, I could see a tiny, distinct square of pale grey light. "I see the sky," I said. "Now, sit in the armchair precisely where Mrs. Stewart was found." I did as he instructed. I leaned back against the cushions. "If she were leaning forward to read," Holmes directed, gently pressing a hand against my back, "her head would be positioned exactly here." I looked up. From that precise angle, leaning forward toward the hearth, the top of my head was directly aligned with the vertical shaft of the chimney. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed, the terrifying reality of the geometry dawning upon me. "Are you suggesting the killer fired a shot straight down the chimney?" "I am not suggesting it, Watson. I am proving it," Holmes said, his eyes glittering. "The murderer required a weapon that was perfectly silent, incredibly accurate, and capable of firing a customized soft-lead bullet. A standard gunpowder rifle would have produced a flash and a thunderous report that would have echoed down the chimney like a cannon shot, rousing the entire household. No, the weapon used was pneumatic. An air rifle." "An air gun?" Farquhar scoffed. "A child's toy? Surely you jest, Mr. Holmes. No air gun could generate the force required to pierce a human skull from the roof of the manor." "I do not speak of a toy, Inspector. I speak of a masterpiece of illicit engineering," Holmes corrected him, his tone grave. "I have heard whispers in the London underworld of a blind German mechanic, a man named von Herder, who constructs custom air rifles for a certain criminal syndicate. These weapons are marvels of pneumatic power. They are completely silent, possess the striking force of a heavy hunting rifle, and are equipped with sophisticated telescopic sights." Holmes began to pace the room. "Consider the sequence of events. The assassin takes his position. He knows Mrs. Stewart's habits intimately. He knows that at a certain hour she sits before the hearth to read. He points his silent weapon down the chimney shaft. He waits for the exact moment she leans forward, bringing the crown of her head into the narrow line of sight. He squeezes the trigger. A faint phut, a rush of air, and the deed is done. The soft bullet strikes, kills, and falls into the ash. The assassin departs, leaving behind an impossible locked-room mystery." "Then the killer was on the roof," Farquhar said, moving toward the door. "We must examine the slates for footprints." "You may save yourself the trouble, Inspector," Holmes said dryly. "The killer was not on the roof." We both stared at him. "Not on the roof?" I asked. "But Holmes, the chimney goes straight up. To shoot down it, the man must be above it." "He must be above it, yes, but not necessarily upon it," Holmes replied, walking to the window and throwing back the velvet drapes. He pointed toward the rugged terrain outside. "I told you to observe the geography, Watson. The chimney flue is narrow, but it does not point directly at the zenith of the sky. The top of the chimney pot is angled slightly toward the west. Now, look out there. What do you see?" Through the gathering gloom, I saw the dark rocky ridge that rose steeply to the west of the manor. Its peak was higher than the roofline of Lauder House. "The ridge," I breathed. "Exactly," Holmes said. "A mathematical calculation of the angle of the flue, The height of the chimney and the distance to that ridge will, I guarantee, draw a perfectly straight line from the rocky summit, down the shaft of the chimney, directly to the crown of the victim's head. The assassin was not on the roof, Watson. He was lying in the heather atop that ridge, nearly 400 yards away. A shot of such unimaginable precision and distance that there are perhaps only 3 men in all of Europe capable of making it. A heavy silence fell upon the room, broken only by the whistling of the wind against the mullioned glass. The sheer, cold-blooded brilliance of the murder sent a chill down my spine. 400 yards, Farquhar muttered, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow. In the dark, down a chimney. It is the work of a demon. Or a very skilled big-game hunter, Holmes said quietly. But the marksman, brilliant as he is merely the instrument, a weapon in the hands of another. We must ask ourselves the oldest question in criminology, Inspector. Cui bono? Who benefits from the death of Euphemia Stewart? Farquhar composed himself. That is a simpler question to answer, Mr. Holmes. Her nephew, Mr. Ronald Stewart. He is her sole heir. He is a young gentleman who spends the majority of his time in London. I telegraphed him yesterday, and he arrived this afternoon. He is downstairs in the drawing-room at this very moment. Holmes's eyes narrowed. In London, you say? How very convenient. Let us go down and have a word with the grieving nephew, shall we? We descended the great staircase to the drawing-room. Ronald Stewart was a handsome man in his late 20s, dressed in impeccable mourning clothes, but his face was haggard, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands possessed a nervous tremor as he poured himself a generous measure of brandy from a crystal decanter. "Inspector," he said, his voice unsteady as we entered, "have you made any progress in finding the blackguard who murdered my aunt?" "We are making inquiries, Mr. Stewart," Farquhar said. "May I introduce Mr. Sherlock Holmes of London?" Stewart's hand jerked, spilling a few drops of the amber liquid onto the polished mahogany table. He recovered quickly, but the flash of sheer panic in his eyes was not lost on either Holmes or myself. "Holmes?" he repeated, forcing a weak smile. "The famous detective? I am honoured. I only wish we were meeting under less tragic circumstances." Holmes did not take the offered hand. Instead, he stood by the fire, studying the young man with cold, analytical eyes. "Tragic indeed, Mr. Stewart," Holmes said, his voice perfectly level. "And quite sudden. Though I imagine her demise relieves you of a rather pressing burden." Stewart flushed angrily. "I beg your pardon? I love my aunt." "Did you?" Holmes asked smoothly. "Perhaps as much as you love the baccarat tables at the Diogenes Club, or the roulette wheels in Mayfair." "I don't know what you mean." Come, Mr. Stewart, it is my business to know things. A man with a nervous tremor, bloodshot eyes, and a tailor in Savile Row who has not been paid in 6 months. You are heavily in debt, sir, dangerously so, to the tune of nearly £20,000 owed to certain unsparing gentlemen in the London underworld, gentlemen who do not take kindly to delayed payments. Pacing Edith. To make this confession feel more satisfying, consider having Holmes produce a prop here. Perhaps he spots a telegram sticking out of Stewart's pocket from his debtors, or notices a distinct gambling marker on his watch chain. Physical evidence makes the cornering of a suspect much stronger. Stewart sank into a chair, all the false bravado draining from his face. He buried his face in his hands. "You know everything, then?" "I know that you faced ruin, perhaps even physical harm, if those debts were not settled. Holmes continued mercilessly. I know that your aunt refused to advance you another penny, and I know that you, being a coward, could not strike the blow yourself. You sought out the very men you owed. A syndicate, an organization that operates in the shadows, dealing in extortion, blackmail, and, for the right price, assassination. I didn't want it to happen like this, Stewart cried, breaking down completely. I only spoke to a man, a terrifying man, an associate of the men I owed. A military man, with cold eyes and a heavy moustache. I told him of my aunt's wealth, her habits, the layout of the house. He said the debt would be forgiven if I provided him with a map of the estate and the exact schedule of her evening reading. He promised it would look like natural causes. He said no one would ever know. A military man, Holmes whispered, exchanging a meaningful glance with me. Colonel Sebastian Moran, unless I am very much mistaken, the second most dangerous man in London, and the employer behind him. No, we shall not speak of the spider at the centre of the web tonight. Holmes turned abruptly to Farquhar. Inspector, you have your man. Mr. Ronald Stewart is guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. As for the assassin, he is long gone, back to the dark heart of London. But he has left his signature behind. Resolution Edit. To give the story a proper ending that wraps up the current action, you might want to add a brief paragraph here describing Inspector Farquhar formally arresting Stewart and leading him away, definitively closing the Lauder House case before shifting focus to the larger Moran threat on the moors. "Can we not pursue this Colonel Moran?" Farquhar asked eagerly, drawing his handcuffs. "Not yet, Inspector," Holmes said, his face grim. "Moran is a tiger, a creature of incredible cunning and patience. He operates under the protection of an intellect far greater than his own. To strike blindly at Moran now would be to alert the master of the web. No, we must bide our time. But I have his measure now. I know his methods, and I know of his silent rifle." The next morning, before we departed for the station, Holmes and I walked out onto the moors, climbing the steep, rocky ridge to the west of the manor. The wind whipped at our coats as we reached the summit. Holmes scoured the ground, his eyes darting over the heather and the jagged stones. Finally, with a sharp cry of satisfaction, he pointed to a small depression in the earth, sheltered behind a large boulder. "Look here, Watson," he said. "The crushed heather, the two distinct indentations in the soil, the resting points of a heavy bipod used to stabilize a rifle barrel. And here—" He reached down with a pair of tweezers and plucked a tiny grey flake from the damp ground. "The ash of a Lovat cigar, Moran's favoured brand." I looked down the slope. From this exact spot, across 400 yards of empty air, the chimney pot of Lauder House was perfectly visible, perfectly aligned. I shuddered at the thought of the cold-eyed sniper lying in this very spot, calculating the wind, the drop, the precise moment to end a life with a silent exhalation of compressed air. "He is a formidable adversary, Holmes," I said quietly. "He is, Watson," Holmes agreed, his eyes fixed on the distant manor. "He is the finest shot in India, and it seems the most ruthless assassin in Europe. We have solved the mystery of Mrs. Stewart's death, but in doing so we have uncovered a darkness far deeper than a greedy nephew." He turned away from the view, pulling his coat tight against the Scottish chill. "Let us return to London, Watson. The board is set, the pieces are moving. We have witnessed the work of the master sniper today. But the day will come, I swear it, when the hunter shall become the hunted." And with that grim prophecy we made our way down the ridge, leaving the tragic shadows of Lauder House behind us, bound once more for the swirling fogs and the waiting dangers of Baker Street. Thank you for watching. Before you go, don't forget to check out our Patreon.